Welcome, fans, to another live edition of the Cheap Heat Productions Pro Wrestling Podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling. We're very pleased tonight to have on a man who is having still an extensive career in the professional wrestling business, a veteran of the original ECW, WWF, and a number of Northeast and other promotions. He is known as the Wise Guy, Jimmy Cicero, real name Matt Bowman. Very much looking forward to this one, being such a fan of that era and especially the original ECW. But before we get to Matt, as per the custom, I have to introduce the man whose channel this is, Mr. Cheap Heat himself, Morris Shortle. Morris, how are you today, sir?
Very, very good. As you know, I'm very busy these days, but we got to keep the show on the road.
Absolutely. Matt, I think it helps the fans get a baseline into an individual's career to ask, when you were growing up, were you a fan of pro wrestling? And if so, did you follow particular companies, territories, or have any particular influences that resulted in you seeking it out as a profession?
Yeah, I was a huge fan, probably from the age of 13, and it happened by accident. I was watching one of the local channels in Virginia, and they had Southwest Championship Wrestling from the Junction out in San Antonio, and I saw Tully Blanchard, Gino Hernandez, and the Masked Grapplers in a match, and I was hooked right from that match. I was literally transfixed, and I think the next week I started scanning the TV guide. I'm aging myself now, okay, to see when wrestling was going to be on the next week. And I saw, that's when I was first exposed to the WWF, and I saw the Wild Samoans, God rest their souls, and they were terrifying. I was just smitten with professional wrestling at that point in time. I couldn't get enough of it. A little while later, probably 6 months later, the network that was showing Southwest switched, and they started putting Georgia Championship Wrestling on, and that was even better. Okay, because we're talking about the territory days now. So, you're talking about Wildfire Tommy Rich, Bob Roop, Ronnie Garvin, Brad Armstrong. So I was completely transfixed, hooked, hook, line, and sinker as a kid. And it had its good points and bad points. I would go to high school, my freshman year in high school, and instead of the history book, instead of studying history, the teacher would come by and pull out a Pro Wrestling Illustrated that was in the middle of my book, because I had to keep up with what was going on in the territories, So.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. I'm sure many of us of the same vintage can relate to that. Wanted to ask you about your training process under the Russian Bear, Ivan Koloff. I haven't had the honor of speaking to many folks who were trained by Ivan, so wanted to know how you hooked up with Ivan and what that looked like from the ground up.
Well, I started off, I wanted to get trained, okay, after I finished high school, and I went down to Norfolk, Virginia, and originally I was going to go and work under Lou Thez out there, and I met with Lou Thez, and he was a gentleman, but he was not, I guess the most polite way to say it, he was not a fan of today's art of professional wrestling. He seemed very down on it, and that kind of killed my excitement, from going to his school. So I wanted to look up some other places, and we're talking back in the early 90s here, so there weren't a lot of places that actually even told you that they're going to teach professional wrestling. I did see a flyer for a place called South Atlantic Pro Wrestling in near Charlotte, okay? And the trainers advertised were Ivan Koloff, Bobby Fulton, Jackie Fulton, and the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez. So I was like, wow, okay, that sounds good. So I called the promoter from South Atlantic, told him I was interested in coming down, and I didn't hear anything for probably 3 or 4 weeks. And then I get, my mother, hollers at me, "Hey, there's a phone call for you. It's Ivan Koloff." So I, pick up the phone and, "Hey, is this Matt? It's Ivan Koloff here." And I said, "Sure." "Okay, Brian, what do you want?" I think it's my buddy, right? Because this is a very nice, smooth, pleasant voice that's saying hello to me. He wasn't calling me a weak American, and he wasn't saying "down with the USA." Wasn't talking about nephew Nikita. He was just saying, "Hey, I understand you'd like to come and check out our school." So it took me a few seconds to realize that it wasn't my buddy Brian. This is actually the Russian Bear, and he gave me a date to go down there to work out with him. He wanted to make sure Ivan, unlike a lot of these current wrestling schools, he wanted to make sure he doesn't want to take your money. He wanted to make sure that there are actual people that want to train to be a professional wrestler, which I did. And so I went down there, I worked out with him for a few days, and then he said, "Okay, you're good. I'm going to accept you as a student, but you have to move here." So I moved from Virginia, Northern Virginia, to Charlotte, and then I went to a school, which is in Indian Trail, North Carolina. And it was a culture shock for me because I didn't know a single soul out in the Charlotte area. I was by myself. I was living in a really tiny 1-bedroom apartment and just doing nothing but training 5 days a week at his school. But I wouldn't trade it for the world. Ivan was probably one of the most patient men I've ever met in my life. He the character that he has could not be farther from the truth from the man that he was. He was soft-spoken, very patient. He was very firm on the things that he taught, but that was because we have to learn how to do it properly, right? If someone's putting their body in my hands and they're trusting me, then I better deliver and take care of that person. So Ivan was, he would always stress the importance of safety, the importance of being able to tell a story with your face, and then just making sure that we're patient, we're not in a rush. This is he taught us for longevity and how to do this for a career and not just for a quick fix.
And what did the training consist of, Matt? Like, was it tough? Like, what was your kind of daily schedules like down there?
Well, it was probably an hour before we even got started. It would be like an hour of diamond push-ups, an hour of burpees, an hour of we'd do these things almost like donkey calf raises where I'd have another student on my back and we'd have to run around the parking lot. It was a lot of stamina, okay? Because, I guess Vince Lombardi once said coward, what is it? If you don't have the stamina, it'll make a coward of us all, okay? And so, I don't think he said it in those words, but I think that was the point. And Ivan wanted to make sure that we were good. Whether the promoter said you have a 5-minute match or a 55-minute match, we had to be prepared. And so to do that, he would make sure that we're not only from a stamina perspective, but also from a perspective of even something like doing ab exercises and everything. It wasn't so much to get a 6-pack for the aesthetics. It would be, hey, look, if I got, someone like King Kong Bundy who's going to come down with a big splash on me and I've got to tighten up so my ribs don't break. Well, that's where the training, the mental training and everything else comes right in from wrestling school. So that would be a staple of that from the very beginning. And then once we got in the ring, he had 2 rings. He had one that was a Mid-Atlantic ring from the Mid-Atlantic wrestling days. And then he had another one that was as hard as a board. I mean, it was so stiff. And that was for the beginners to get our back used to bumping. Okay, so we just have to bump and bump and bump to the point where our backs felt normal to take a bump. It's wrestling's a weird thing. We all have mental issues because we all think it's normal to do these things like bump or go up to the top buckle and take a slam. Most people, they look at it and say, hell no, I'm not doing that. But that's the way that we're trained. And that's what we have to almost like retool our brain.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You mentioned Bundy, and I noticed in doing some research into your career, you literally wrestled basically a who's who of legends and contemporaries. Just want to intersperse throughout the interview, throw a couple of names at you and your memories of working with them, and it might as well start with Bundy, who I know you, at least according to the record, shared the ring with in various capacities on multiple occasions.
Right. And Chris was such a wonderful person. He was a jokester in the back. He would tell really good jokes. He would always keep the boys laughing. He was absolutely brutal on me whenever I would try to tell a joke. He would just yell, "Cicero, your jokes are terrible," which they probably were. They were dad jokes, right? In the ring, he was just so much fun to work with. He was larger than life, and he was a professional. He wanted to make sure that the fans that came to the arena that night, wherever we were, got their money's worth. And we had shows that were, like you said, in all different places in the Northeast. But one particular show we had was an outdoor show in the middle of August, near Ocean City, and it was probably about, I don't know, 105 degrees in the ring, because we're talking about a shiny, tarp. So to even get in the ring, to touch the ring, it felt like we were gonna get second or third degree burns. And yet Bundy, he was of the mindset, now we still got to give these fans that came out here a good quality match, right? So a total professional. He was not someone who mailed it in.
Another man we had down here is a man who'd probably appreciate your shirt there, Bam Bam Bigelow. Any impressions of him?
Yeah. Bigelow was probably one of my first bigger superstars that I worked after graduating. I was really young in my career then, and I was petrified. Just because he was at the time, he'd just come off runs with the WWF, and also he had done some stuff in the NWA with Barry Windham and everything, and with Humperdinck as his manager. And he was really nice. I mean, and he guided me through the match. I listened to him, and of course I was jittery, and I was probably going way too fast. And he would just tell me to slow down, kid. You're doing fine. Relax a little bit. But we ended up, when the match was over, I was delighted, because I was like, wow, I actually did it. I actually got in the ring. And like I said, he was the first opponent that I worked with that was mainstream, And so for me, not that the other guys weren't. The other people that I worked, everybody, on all levels. I'm not derogatory about anybody, but it was really special to be able to get in the ring with him, and it got some what do you call it? Some media attention and everything else, which is really cool. And then some of my friends from Pro Wrestling Illustrated at the time, they went ahead and did some clips of it and everything else. So it was pretty neat, and I was very thankful for that.
Nice.
Another legend of the Mid-Atlantic and Georgia wrestling that I saw you wrestle as Demolition Axe, Bill Eadie.
Oh yeah. And Bill Eadie, here's the thing about Bill Eadie, so smart, right? Such a smart heel, and he gave great advice to me as well. In the back, our matches were fine, but I think I learned so much more. I learned a lot from that, but I learned a lot just talking to him in the back in the locker room. Because we were talking about his mass superstar days, and I said I always knew, there was no doubt that it was the same person under the mask, because he was so articulate. And Bill said, well, he did that because he saw so many other heels doing the same thing. They would just get in front of a microphone, yell at the top of their lungs, and it was kind of, a tired shtick. And what Bill would do he would come out, and he used to be I think he was a teacher in his downtime, kind of like George Steele. These people are teachers, right, for students. Bill would come out and give. He would sound very articulate. He would sound calm. He wouldn't yell. If you watch some of his interviews way back in the day with Gordon Soley back in Georgia, and he's talking about wrestling too, or Tommy Rich, and he, dare I say, he sounds more educated in the interview than Tommy Rich. And I love Tommy. Tommy's great, but Tommy's yelling as a Southern boy, fired up babyface, and Bill Eadie's coming out and saying, hey, if you think that I'm trying to look my nose down at you and everything else, well, I am, and he would just be so. And as a fan, you're watching this going, this guy, what a jerk. But yet he would get his point across. So you would have as a fan, he would make sure that you were digesting the message that he's trying to send.
We might get back to a few more names in a little bit, but I
Sure.
just wanted to know how you ended up working for ECW then in '96.
I had worked some shows in Maryland, and there was a guy on the ECW roster named Hack Myers. And Hack, I talked to Hack at the time, and I said, hey, I'd really love to get a chance to come up and, even if it's working undercard or just doing something to get my foot in the door to try to get some exposure and get that experience. And Hack was a really nice guy, and he talked to Paul Heyman and said, yeah, you know what? I'll tell you what, you can come up to Allentown in 3 weeks and you could ride with me. So I rode up with Hack Myers, and, I was expecting just to go around and shake hands and just kind of sit in the corner and take everything in. And Hack comes over and he goes, oh, by the way, you're working Taz in the first match. I'm like, oh. And this is when Taz was literally, I think it was around the time when he was working with Sabu, and he was dumping people on their heads, and in a safe way. Taz was he was a nice guy, but boy, was he intense. And I was like, holy crap. And the thing that Hack kept telling me to do, he said, listen, go up to him, find out what he wants to do. He's getting a major push right now, so you just do exactly what he tells you. And which I did. We went in, we had a match. It probably lasted 3 minutes, maybe. And he ended up hitting me with one of his German suplexes and then putting me into a submission hold. I tapped, whether I liked it or not, I tapped. And but then afterwards, Hack said, listen, go thank him. I thanked him. About a half an hour later, Hack says, go thank him again. Okay. He wanted to make sure that I was not going to be on the wrong side of politics in that locker room. So it was great advice. That's advice I give the younger guys now, which is, listen, you don't want to be that can make or break you more than any move set that you have, or skill set in the ring. I can hit a shooting star. That's not going to matter if you're, not welcome in that locker room, or you make yourself seem like a prima donna, or not grateful, or not thankful. It's the politics, and it probably goes in most sports as well. But professional wrestling does have a niche for that, as far as when you get there, you greet everybody. When you leave, you say goodbye. And when you're around veterans or people that are, higher on the pecking order, you make sure you let them know that you're very appreciative. And I knew that from Ivan, but Hack, I really appreciated the fact that he stayed right there for me and made sure, hey, listen, leave no doubt in your mind, because Taz was one of the movers or shakers in that promotion. Very influential, right? So if there was even a hint of me not being thankful, then that could spell the end before it even gets started, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Matt, did you find that a lot of people say about Taz in that era in ECW, he had a lot of power and stuff? Was that your impression there or anything like that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. There are leaders in the locker room, in every locker room that you go to, and he was undoubtedly one of the leaders in that locker room. I mean, it was, other than Paul, Tommy Dreamer obviously was one of the leaders. Taz was one of the leaders. Devon and Bubba Ray were leaders. These are the guys that you wanted to make sure that you were on the good side of the fence with them, respectful on whatever they wanted to do, and understand the big story of what we're accomplishing here in professional wrestling, which is, it's not about Matt Bowman or Jimmy Cicero. It's about, okay, what does the company need Matt Bowman or Jimmy Cicero to do? And if they're pushing a big angle with the Dudleys, say against the Pit Bulls, and they need Matt Bowman or Jimmy Cicero to get power bombed or super bombed by the Pit Bulls or something, to further that angle to show how bad and how tough the Pit Bulls are, then that's my role. It's almost like when you think of an acting role or something like that, and some people, hey, your role is going to be, you're going to walk in and Chuck Norris is going to kick you in the head, or I'm going to be the guy at the bar that walks over and pours a beer on his boot in the first scene of the movie, and he kicks me in the head and knocks me out cold. Well, the whole point of that isn't to get me over, it's to get him over. But if that's my role, then I'm appreciative to be a cog in that machine.
And of course, we couldn't be talking about ECW without the man who created it, Paul Heyman. And did you have any interactions with him? And if so, what was your impression of how he ran that locker room?
Well, he ran the locker room like a college football coach runs his team. He was very, he had those guys, meaning everybody, okay, ready to literally go through a wall for him, okay? His motivational speaking talents weren't just a work for the cameras and the television audience. His motivational speeches to the locker room and to the boys was like no other that I've ever seen, and from the promoters that I've worked for. And that's for guys. Look, I was one of the guys that was on the low end of the totem pole. I was one of the lower paid guys, and a lot of the times if I was on the show, if I was at the arena, but say it was a 3 or 4 day swing, and say I only worked one match or two matches in those 4 days, I'd only get paid for those two matches, right? So it wasn't like I was getting rich, okay? But yet I still would find myself driving 8 hours to Boston, Massachusetts, and hoping that I'm going to be put on this show in one capacity or another. Hopefully I'm wrestling, or I'm going to do a pull apart, or maybe if I'm, if nothing else, hey, I'm going to be in the ring to wrestle one of the other guys, Danny Doring or something, and then out comes 911, or out comes Big Dick Dudley, and they're going to choke slam both of us. And again, it's one of those things that, unfortunately, a lot of today's guys, younger guys anyway, don't necessarily understand, which is everybody pays their dues, and everyone has got to help the other guys to get over, right? And so that was my role there. Paul Heyman was it was quite an experience, and now in my later years, I'm almost 56 years old. I'm able to share some of that, regurgitate some of what he said to the younger guys that I see on some of these wrestling cards and shows. And, people may say a lot of things good or bad about him. And I know that there were some issues financially with some of the guys that were under contract and maybe didn't get paid. I didn't fall into that category. So I don't speak on things that didn't necessarily affect me. All I can tell you is that he was a terrific motivator, and boy, he got those crowds all, up and down from Philly to Boston and everywhere in between. He got those crowds really fired up.
Was there anything funny that you seen backstage, or anything shocking that you seen in the ring during your time there that you remember to this day? Like, what's kind of an outstanding memory there?
No, I mean, it kind of was a shoot. Okay. I mean, if you get there and look, Sandman drank a lot of beer, and that was a shoot. That wasn't a gimmick. It was the way it really was. Jean-Claude or Rob Zukowski, Rob Van Dam. Okay. He would be very mellow if you read between the lines there, right? That's just the way it was. There weren't a lot of issues. The boys it was a close-knit group there. And there were guys that were, I was one of the guys that would try to stay quiet, be polite. I was fortunate to have guys that they kind of took me under their wing, like the Blue Meanie, who was always very kind. Nova, was always a very nice guy, and yeah, these are guys that looked out for me. The pit bulls, both of them, were super nice and everything else. And then there were some of the other guys that it was kind of cliquish. They were, Raven and Sandman, and those guys would kind of be in their clique. They were nice, but again, as a young guy in that promotion, I didn't assume anything, and I tried to just make sure that you stayed in my lane.
Mhm.
You did a lot of work in other organizations with the late Balls Mahoney under various guises that he had, but wanted to ask you about your team with him in ECW when you had a couple of opportunities. I know you worked Bubba and Spike, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you also faced Team 3D on some of the independents. What was it like generally working with the Dudley crew with Balls?
It was fun. Balls, God rest his soul, would drink a lot, okay, before the matches. So it was always a guess as to how functional the match would be. Okay. Working with Bubba and Devon, they were total professionals. I mean, they were great. They would, and again, it was very stiff. It was a very snug match working with those guys, but always a lot of fun working with both of those guys. Again, with Balls, he could be a little bit. Well, I got a quick story I'll tell you if you got the time.
Yeah.
I worked against him in a Maryland match, and he had drunk so much. Okay, are you ready to get shocked? He drunk so much, and the finish was supposed to be he wraps a chain around his foot and gives me a super kick right here, right? Well, he didn't get me here. He got me here in the mouth. And as a result of that, I got no teeth. Okay? I told you I was going to shock you. You should get lots of views from this.
That's a clip.
Okay?
Clip.
Yes. It's all for the business. It's good business, right? But he knocked my front teeth out, so I had to actually go and get the rest of them taken out. And now I've got dentures, So when people say, "That was Balls," I'm like, well, I guess that's a complicated question. He was a really nice person. I got along well with him. We, had a lot of laughs and everything, except for that night. That night was not a good night for me. But if nothing else, it's a good story to tell, right? And that was so long ago that I'm fine with my dentures now. Okay.
It's funny you mentioned that, because that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. The locker room, and we've spoken to a lot of ECW originals that talk about that locker room and that substance abuse that seemed to be a hallmark of that. Aside from Balls, and you mentioned Sandman, who was quite a imbiber as a shoot. Did you notice a lot of that, and was that something that unsafe aspect that you experienced more severely than a lot of people, that was as rampant as the mythology would have it?
Yeah, I mean, it was with certain people. I mean, there were a lot of guys that couldn't be more professional and really safe. And like I said, Nova, Tommy Dreamer, the Blue Meanie, those guys were great. Even guys, like I said, Danny Doring, Chris Chetty, really great wrestlers. Chris Candido, fantastic. Shane Douglas could not have been more of a professional than Shane Douglas. But I did travel quite a bit with Axel Rotten, and that was an experience. Axel, at the time, took a lot of what they called somas, okay, which it was a pill that would make you relax, and he would take an abundance of them. Okay. And then he would also do some other things as well. And Axel, to me, it was probably the biggest waste of a resource because Axel was so smart when it came to the psychology of the business, when it came to what makes fans tick, what's going to make them turn the TV on, what's going to make them stand up, sit down, cry, cheer. I mean, he had the ability to do that at any waking moment, and he had the ability to pass that on to other people. So he was so smart. He would have had such a great career as an agent, I think, in the big leagues after his wrestling days were done. But unfortunately, the demon of opioids, just it won, and that was sad. And like I said, I traveled a lot with Axel, and I liked him a lot. He was a funny guy, a nice guy. I mean, a lot of the time we wouldn't even talk about wrestling. We'd talk about football, or we'd go watch, goofy movies. If it's in between 2 or 3 shows, we'd all go to the movie theater and go watch. I remember we all went and saw Austin Powers in Boston, and just had so much fun. We all went to Cheers, the original Cheers bar down there. And, he was almost like a big kid, but he was a big kid with a really bad habit, and the bad habit killed him. And now I don't like to gloss over that, because now as a a guy in my mid 50s, and I've got grandkids and I've got adult children of my own, and I'll let them know, Axel, I love him to death, but boy, you do not want to follow that path that he took, okay? Because it'll kill you.
Was it hard to stay away from all that kind of stuff in the business, because it was like kind of rock and roll lifestyle, like being in a band, like being on the road, going out with the boys every night?
Yeah, it earlier on it was, just because you want to be accepted, right? And so you're almost like, wow, I don't want to insult these people, by by acting like I'm too good for this, or so. Yeah, you're seeing all of this, and I'm also terrified that someone's gonna, the cops are gonna come knocking on some of these hotel doors, and I'm gonna get in trouble, and I'm not even doing anything. I didn't really indulge in any of that. I think I indulged. I mean, I did marijuana sometimes back then, and that was a long time ago. We're talking about mid '90s. I mean, I'm squeaky clean now. Okay, I have a security clearance, so obviously I have to be clean, and I've been squeaky clean now for at least the last 25 years. But back in those days, I partake a little bit, but nothing close to what was going on there. I think to segue, I think probably the scariest moment that I ever had when it came to any kind of drugs was when we were taking a trip up to where was it? It was up in Pennsylvania, I think. I don't know if it was Massanutten, or it was a show that we were doing up there, and I was traveling, and Iron Sheik was in the front seat along, and one of my tag partners, Julio Sanchez, or Julio De Niro, okay, he was with me in the back seat, Iron Sheik, and then the promoter was driving, and we're heading up, and we're all having fun and talking and shooting the breeze and everything else. And Iron Sheik, he says, "Hey, Jimmy Bubba," and he calls, of course, Bubba, followed by everyone's first wrestling name, whatever else. "Here you go. This is a gift from Sheik." And he hands me a little pipe, and he goes, "This is Georgia Rock." And I went, "Okay." And I'm looking at it like, what the hell is it? Georgia. And it looks like a little pebble that's in this thing, right? And I'm like this, and I'm looking at it like, because I have no idea what the hell it is. Excuse my French, right? And Julio says to me, he says under his breath, "Cicero, that's crack." And I'm looking at that and I'm going, oh shit. Because I've never do that. And I'd heard that if you do that one time, you're going to be addicted for the rest of your life. I mean, that's, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what I heard. So I was like terrified. But here I am, a gift from the Iron Sheik. In his mind, he was being nice. Mm-hmm. So I ended up doing my absolutely worst acting job. And I said, "My throat's really sore, Sheik. I can't do it right now, but I really appreciate it." And I handed it back to him. So I got out of it. He wasn't insulted. I didn't have to do it. But boy, I was terrified. and like I told my wife, I said, look, I said, Shiki was just, that was his way of being nice. He wasn't, he truly wasn't trying to get this kid, Jimmy Cicero, hooked on crack. He was just trying to be really nice and share
Share the goods.
his partying, you know, his party, you know, vices or whatever. But that's just tip of the iceberg on the crazy things that can happen.
Wise decision.
Moving away from ECW for a minute, you debuted in the WWF in '97. I, according to the research that I did, in a dark match against a man whose path you crossed many times. That was Steve Corino and MSG. How did that come about, and what was it like to be wrestling in the Mecca, the absolute top of the top venue at the time of professional wrestling?
That was, I still count that as one of my greatest times, and it was because of Steve, first of all, because Steve has been one of my good friends and a wonderful person for pretty much my entire career. Steve and I worked on the indies together, and I learned so much being around him and traveling with him. And he and I were booked to work as extras, you know, to work underneath for this particular swing. For when they were in the Northeast, Howard Finkel would book us for, you know, 4 or 5 shows that were happening in the Northeast, right? Because we lived in that area. And we're thinking there's not a chance we're going to be working in Madison Square Garden. We're there, but in the times past when we had been booked for Madison Square Garden, we had never worked. We had just gotten dressed and sat in the back and waited for Tony Gurria to come and tell us, nah, you're not needed tonight, you know, and that was fine. I got it. I was happy just to be there. I was still getting paid, but, you know, of course we wanted to work. And we're sitting there and just shooting the breeze, and we're dressed, but we're thinking there's not a chance we're going to wrestle. And one of the Hebner twins come back and looks at us, the two of us, and says, okay, Cicero and Corino, I need you two right now. They need a match. Okay. They're trying to kill some time, you know? So, I mean, I can tell you that they want that my charisma killed them, and they want, you know, wooed them into this, but that wasn't the case. They said, you know, Corino and Cicero, we need you, 10-minute match right now. Follow me. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I guess I got to get oiled up, and you know, no time. We got to go right now. So we're following Hebner, and we're walking behind him, and I'm going, oh crap. And he basically turned around just long enough to say, because Corino had the long hair at the time, and it was a good looking guy. And he said, okay, you're the baby face, you're the heel, you're going over. So Corino's going over, about a 10-minute match. I'm the heel. That's all he told us. So we're like, okay, wow. So Steve says, well, what do you want to do for this match? Well, the previous weeks before that match, Steve and I had spent some time in Tennessee working for Dutch Mantel in the USWA. And every other night, one of us would end up working a guy named Paul Diamond. Okay. Now, Paul Diamond at that stage of his career wasn't very motivated. Great wrestler and everything else, but he just was not very motivated at that particular time to do a lot. So he would have the same exact match every night. So Steve and I were kind of like, oh, geez, these matches are so boring. We have to do the same thing with Paul every night. And it would be like whoever, I don't mean this in a bad way, but whoever was going to wrestle Paul Diamond, the other one would go, that's your turn to get it now, right? So as we're walking to the gorilla deck in Madison Square Garden, I looked at Steve and I said, we don't have any choice, dude. We've got to do the Paul Diamond match. He was like, no, we're in the Mecca and we're going to do the match that I hate. And I'm like, we don't have a choice. We have no time to go over anything. And we both know that match in the back of our head like nothing. I mean, we can do it in our sleep because we've done it so many times. So the rib was on us. We're sitting there and we're doing a match that's so generic, and yet and yet we don't have time to do anything else. So I said, okay, I'm Paul Diamond. You be the baby face. Let's go do this thing. So we went out there and we had a really good match. The match turned out to be really good. Everyone liked it. Probably the funniest part of the match was when Steve grabbed me in a chin lock and he says, "Hey, Cicero, look up." So I look up and I see he and I on the Titantron, right? Probably the world's biggest television set. And I look up and I see he with a chin lock on me on the biggest TV in the world. And we both sat there stunned. We're like, wow, that's really cool. And I was like, we better get back to this match. We're actually wrestling right now. So we're like starstruck by ourselves because we're on the TV on the Titantron. But we got back to it, had a really good match, served the purpose. The promoter or the guy that was in charge of all that, Tony Gurria and the Hebners and all those, the people that were in charge of the underneath matches that we were doing, were very happy and mission accomplished. But for me, I was like, it was like, wow, wait a minute, I just wrestled in Madison Square Garden. So yeah, it was really cool. It was something that I never thought I would be able to do, and it was pretty neat.
Not too many people can say they've wrestled there, and we're gonna talk about a few more of your matches. But I want to know, like, some guys we were talking to, like, be called in, you kind of referenced it there, maybe extra work or something like that. Is there anything that springs to mind from WWF that you were called in to do, kind of extra work over the years? Any fun stories there?
Yeah, there's a couple. There's a couple. I did one of the WrestleManias, one where Big Show was arrested by Mr. McMahon, and I was one of the cops that arrested him I don't know if it was WrestleMania 15 or 13, but he was it was the one Pete Rose was on there, Butterbean was there. So whichever WrestleMania that is, where Butterbean was there and fought Bart Gunn, that was a cool night. And when we were arresting, when my wife watched the replay of that, she gave me such a hard time because she said I was so cheap. Because as I'm arresting him, about 5 or 6 cops, we're all cops, we're putting him in the vehicle, in the car, and of course I keep glancing back at the hard camera, okay? Because I want to get my face seen on WrestleMania, okay?
You're right.
So yeah, I was cheap. I was a nerd, and I don't care because I was going to have my face on WrestleMania. So that was a lot of fun. Another interesting note on that was when we were having the buffet earlier that day, the catering, voice behind me says, "Wow, the spread looks really good." Talking about all the food that they had. And I went, yeah, it does look pretty good. I turn around, it's Pete Rose. Okay, the legendary baseball player, just making small talk about how good because he was a guest on that card, making small talk about this, and I literally am just going, I'm having a conversation with Pete Rose. This is bizarre. I had your baseball cards, right? But it was pretty cool. It was a pretty neat moment. So yeah, there was that. I was a druid one time where we had to push Shawn Michaels in a casket to the ring, and fans were going to think it's the Undertaker, and of course it was when the Undertaker was in a program against Shawn. Right, they were working together, and Taker was in the ring already, and we're pushing a casket down, and it's supposed to be like, what the heck's going on here? And then opens it up, and then Shawn Michaels hops out and starts doing his, boy toy dance and everything. But the interesting part about that is that earlier in the day, we all were practicing, all of us druids were practicing pushing the casket down the ramp. And that casket was so heavy and so awkward to push on its wheels. And I'm like, guys, this is going to be horrible if this casket ends up falling off the ramp on live television. I said, we're not only going to get fired, we're going to get murdered, because you're pushing a casket down a ramp with Shawn Michaels in it. I said, you talk about, pressure, but it was, it worked out okay. And, we did that. I got beaten up once by the APA, by Bradshaw and Ron Simmons in a bar. We did a bar fight in State College, Penn State College. I had a speaking part in that one. It was pretty fun, and I told Bradshaw and Ron Simmons they're just a couple of fake wrestlers, and yeah, they beat our asses pretty good in that. It was a probably 30, 35, 40-second fight, but they told us ahead of time, hey, listen, this is going to be, it's almost going to be like a shoot because there are real bar patrons that are going to be in here. So you can't really work a punch or work any of this stuff with them right on top of you. They're like 2 inches away from you. So do any of you guys want to back out now? And a couple of you guys did back out. But you know, the few of us that did, we stayed. I said, listen, I've got Advil in my bag, so I'm good to go. Beat me up as much as you need to. I'll take some Advil afterwards and go from there. And it was, you know, it would happen so fast. I was sore the next day, to be sure, but it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and Ron and Bradshaw were really cool.
Yeah, I remember that segment quite well. That's one heck of a feather in your cap. What about working with an enigmatic figure in the business to this day that you wrestled on Shotgun Saturday Night, and that's the Lethal Weapon Steve Blackman, a man who's almost disappeared off the entire scene to this day that everybody has an interest in.
Yeah, Steve Blackman was legitimate. I mean, he was a real fighter, and it was a good fighter. So I wanted to make sure, you know, I'd wrestled him, and I'd also had some matches prior to working with him with Dan Severn, and I learned from that, from working with, because Dan Severn's someone who could, I mean, he could kill you with his bare hands if he wanted to, right? But he you know, he was real nice, and Steve was nice too. Steve wasn't the warmest, fuzziest guy in the world, but he wasn't a bad person or anything like that. And he wasn't a jerk. He was just very serious. He was, I guess that would be the word I would use to describe him, is serious. He was a very serious guy. I definitely felt he was very snug. I felt everything he did in the ring, to be sure. But nah, I mean, he was good, and he was a real gentleman and a professional as well, you know, before the match and after the match.
Well, while we're on the topic, you mentioned Dan Severn, the Beast, that I was also going to ask. You wrestled him a couple of times, but you got around this time frame, if the research is correct, you got an NWA World Title shot against him. How did that come together for you?
I have no idea, because a lot of the on the indies and working my way up, you know, in the NWA, you know, I would consider myself the Cleveland Browns or the Detroit Lions of professional wrestling. I was not anything as far as you know, when you think about a win-loss record, I was not one of those people who counted or cared. But I was always a good hand, and I was responsible, and I would, you know, the promoter could count on me. And I'm guessing that between that and probably some feedback from Steve Carino, who would always go to bat and you know, help me out with bookings or put me over, and Tom Brandy, another guy who was always a big brother to me. Between Tom and Steve Carino, they helped me get a lot of the breaks that I landed.
Did you ever have any interactions or meet him along the lines through the extra work, through the appearances in WWF with Vince McMahon?
Just saying hello. I mean, you know, and even then, being petrified. You know, I don't want to get on this guy's bad side, but he was, you know, to the undercard guys and everything else, I think he was always very pleasant and nice. And you know, he was a busy guy, so you know, I'd be lying if I told you that there were these cool conversations, and he was, you know, really nice and super. It never got to that point. It was always one of those guys where if he's in the hallway, I would just say hello and go about my way. I was probably 10 levels below him. You know what I mean? He's dealing with the Undertakers and Steve Austins of the world, and you know, I'm delegated down to, you know, Tony Gurria, you know, or Blackjack Lanza, you know, the guys like that.
You mentioned just earlier about being a spoke in the wheel and being a part of the show. Like we've talked to a lot of people that have been in that situation over their careers. Do you think it's something that's lacking in the business now? Do you know that everyone has to be a personality almost now? But even with saying that, all the guys these days kind of look the same, so it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, it's nowadays it's kind of cookie cutter, and I don't want to sound like the old grumpy veteran, but it's very cookie cutter, and they tell you what look they want and what and how they're going to go about doing it. And back in, we would be taken back in the territory days, and even right after the territory days, you'd have a promotion where you'd have guys that look like Dick Murdoch or Dusty Rhodes. You'd also have Lex Luger, and you got guys like Barry Windham, Brad Armstrong. They'd come in all shapes and all sizes. And in the territories and in the well-run independent promotions, they would be able to develop good characters, And when when I speak about Bill Eadie as the Masked Superstar, he told me he spoke and did things his way because nobody else was doing it that way. No other heels were doing it that way. Nowadays, it's very cookie cutter. A lot of these guys, everyone's got great physiques now, but the personality sometimes is lacking. And yeah, and I think that also some people, the media and the internet and everything else has changed, the whole perspective of professional wrestling to where everyone wants to be a star. And, I was trained by a former world champion, Ivan Koloff. He beat Bruno. He was a former world champion. But to me, that was great. But, if it wasn't in the cards for me to be a top tier star like that, or even a top tier star like a lot of my contemporaries, right? Like Steve Corino, who became a top tier star. To me, I was like, okay. And Steve had lots of charisma and everything else. To me, I developed more charisma as I got older, and I developed more confidence as I got older, which was a real pain in the butt because I'm like, well, I can't get signed now, but now I have the game finally slowed down for me, but I was getting too old. But I really valued my position as an extra or as enhancement or as a good quality guy on the independent circuit, a reliable guy, and that's kind of what my reputation is. It's just you can book me, and I'm not gonna. You tell me what you need. I'm not gonna have a problem with it. I'm gonna help out the younger guys. Let's go out and have a good match, and try to share some of that perspective in terms of saying, hey, listen, guys, even if it's at a show where there's 50 people. To me, I look at it and say, okay, well, there's 50 people here, but those 50 people chose us instead of going to the movies, instead of going golfing, instead of going to on a picnic or going to a comedy show. They chose us, so let's make them glad that they chose us, right? And that was the kind of perspective that was passed down to me, not only from Ivan and Tom Brandy, but from some of the other veterans like Buddy Landell and guys that had helped me out in my younger days.
Yeah, speaking of territory days, I read with great interest that you're one of the few guys in the modern era, the more modern era, to have a staple of the territories match, and that's a dog collar match. Can you talk about how difficult that is to put together and some of the I know you got whacked with the chain from balls inadvertently, but the regular chain match, that danger involved in that.
As long as you're a lot of the time what I did and the chain match, the dog collar match that I had was with a younger guy. So I called the match. So I made sure that he understood, what we're going to do. I dictated the pace. And I was the heel. Okay. So I would make sure I put him in a position to shine, but I would take my own bumps on this. And I would make sure that if I'm going to get hit with the chain, it's going to be in a way where it's bald, and I'm going to be able to dictate how I'm getting hit with this chain safely, right? So it was a fun match. It required some color, and I know color is kind of taboo with a lot of people now, my wife would probably kill me if I got color now, but but it was at the time it was something that was necessary. We thought to end the angle that we were doing, and a lot of and the guy that I worked was great, good kid, a lot of fun, and yeah, I mean it was not as hard as you would think. Sometimes these specialty matches, can be easier. Than you're literally hooked together with someone with the dog collar, so you're not. It's not like you're going to get blown up running back and forth, hitting the ropes and doing these spots. So for some, in some cases, you're going, wow, that's even harder because now you're out of breath and you're 10 minutes in the match. Dog collar match is a lot of selling and a lot of facial expression, and you're probably doing more of that to get to give to the fans, and watch a lot of film of Roddy Piper and Greg Valentine, and steal as much as you can from those guys.
Mm-hmm.
One big man you worked with in 1997, I'd be curious to hear about is Kurgan. You got any memories of working with him?
Oh yeah. Kurgan was it was intimidating with him, but he was again such a nice guy, really imposing. But he was almost as nervous because he was pretty new to the business, so he was almost as nervous as I. He was actually, yeah, he was. I was more nervous than him because he's Kurgan, okay. But he was still a little bit apprehensive, a little bit nervous. You want to make sure he didn't hurt me, didn't kill me, or anything like that. And funny story, a few years after that, my wife and I went to go see the movie Sherlock Holmes, and he's a villain in Sherlock Holmes, with Robert Downey, right? And I'm watching, and I didn't know he was a villain in that movie. So we're watching the movie, and all of a sudden he comes out and is trying to kill Sherlock Holmes, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's Robert, right? That's his real name is Robert Millett, and I thought that's him. Oh my God, he's in the movie. And my wife's like, okay. And I'm like, no, I had a match against him. He's really cool. And then we saw him a few years later at a autograph session, right? It was one of these big signings and everything else. And I was at one table and he walked in, and I walked over to him with my wife and I said, I guarantee you don't remember me, but I want to see if you can take a picture with me. I said, we work together. He goes, no, I remember you. He goes, I got you on my wall. I got a picture of me giving the claw hold to you on my wall framed. And I'm like, wow, that's really cool, so pretty neat, and a real nice guy too.
Well, Matt, we seem to have, as expected, burned through this hour. Greatly appreciate your time, but I wanted to close with your thoughts on, and you've kind of touched on it to a degree already, but just the fact that the business has moved away from mechanics and enhancement talent for, in favor of everyone being generic, basically, and everybody has to be a main event guy. But do you think the business has suffered specifically by the lack of enhancement guys? And do you think there should be some rightful recognition for those fellows in, the big Hall of Fame?
I do think there should be some recognition. I think that the business will be fine as far as that goes. I just think because it continues to change with the times, right? So, I would be remiss if I said, it's the good days. My days were the best, and the stuff that they have now is no good. There are fantastic athletes that are out there right now. They're just I list one of my friends, Chase Owens, is probably one of the best out there right now, and I think that I give a shout out to him and some of the young stars that are out there. But I do think that there was a place for enhancement talent. I think that's a great place to develop. I think a lot of some of the biggest superstars that people know nowadays or can relate to have all been enhancement guys. Shawn Michaels started off as an enhancement guy in World Class and in Mid-South, right? So there's a lot of, everyone that you think of has started off enhancement. Al Snow, go on and on and on. Do I think there should be a Hall of Fame mention for guys like that? Absolutely. I think someone like George South, to me, down here in Alabama, Mike Jackson he's still active. And this is someone who I grew up as a teenager watching on Georgia Wrestling. Okay. I've worked with him several times here in Alabama, and this guy is phenomenal. He's literally 75 years old, and he's calling the match to me, and I'm having to make sure that I can keep up with him. Okay. So, yeah, I think that there's absolutely a place for a Hall of Fame for the guys that have done so much and have been so giving. I'm not saying for everybody, but I think guys like Mike Jackson, guys like George South, and I can't think of anybody else off the top of my head right now, but there are plenty of other guys that have done so much for the business.
Where can the fans find you if you have a social media presence, and do you have anything upcoming that they'd like to promote? Please take this opportunity.
Sure. Now, if you go to YouTube or to Google and look up Rocket City Championship Wrestling, and that's right near the Huntsville area where I live now. I'm an instructor at the school that they have there, so I'm helping out with the young students that they have there. And I'm also I've wrestled there for the last 3 years, and I have a heel clique that we out there called the Lord's Army. I work as Lord James Cicero, so it's a little bit of deviation from the wise guy Jimmy Cicero, taking a little bit from Lord James Blears and Lord Alfred Hayes. Of course, and today's audience are not going to know who they are, but trust me, they were good. And what we're doing is we run bi-weekly shows at Rocket City Championship Wrestling. Have a fantastic crowd audience out there. They're really lively. Probably some of the best fans I've ever been in front of. Barry Kohlhoff runs the promotion, and it's second to none. It's a fantastic indie. It gives you the same feel. It's run in a studio, so it gives you the same feel as the old Georgia Championship Wrestling studio, if you can remember that.
Nice.
Excellent. Well, I want to once again thank you for your time tonight, Matt. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm sure we could, if you ever have the time again, do another hour. So greatly appreciated, sir.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to talk with both of you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, fans, that's it for this edition of the Cheap Heat Productions Pro Wrestling Podcast. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, like these videos, and you won't miss any of the great content upcoming. And be sure to follow the YouTube channel where we're continuously updating that and putting new videos. So appreciate all your support. Subscriber growth is continuing, and only good things to come. Until next time, take care, everybody.
Thank you very much for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel if at all possible. It would really help me out. And don't forget, you can check out my back catalog